Welcome. My name is Vishwas. I'm one of the co-organizers of this event. Tonight we're going to try and put Donald Trump into perspective. Now, we're living at a very interesting time when we can actually pathologize the United States. We are all not living in the failed world and in the failed state. We can peer into the United States. And it's got to do with the information age. We can look at it squarely and we can dissect it. I love that. I study international relations. But Trump, of course, is more than the individual. Trump is a phenomenon. And my moniker for Trump is, this is the quintessential postmodern fascist. That articulates various things: race, sexism, jingoistic, narrow chauvinistic nationalism, and so on. But again, I might have it wrong. There might be a whole lot of other things at play here, a whole set of conditions that have thrown up Trump, including, of course, the weakening of labor in the US context. The Trump effect also has been noted as something that has global ramifications. Trump's tweets kind of unsettle and unhinge us in different quarters of the world. So there's something about this that we really have to think about. So we are really privileged and honored this evening to have with us Professor Vivek Chibber. Vivek's not new to South Africa. He's been on this platform last year, speaking on postcolonial theory. He's been here previously also speaking on the developmental state in South Africa. Vivek is a professor of sociology at New York University. His book, Locked in Place, which looks at the developmental state experience in India, has won 5 awards, including the Wellington Moore Award. His recent book, The Specter of Capital, basically engages with postcolonial theory, particularly a current within that, subaltern studies. Has also won the Pews Award in the American Sociological Association as best book. And the kind of debates that have been sort of swirling around that have been compiled into an important book called Debate on Postcolonial Theory and the Specter of Capital. So we have Vivek here to kind of unpack that, but Vivek is also engaged with activism and in dialogue with movements and so on. And this is a new journal that he's involved with. I don't know if any of you know Jacobin magazine in the US. Well, Catalyst is coming out of a partnership or a relationship with them, and this is the first issue. And the second issue is apparently in production, and there's a perspective in there on South Africa and the South African political dynamic. And I think Vivek's inviting us to also contribute to Catalyst, to renew global left debates, global left perspectives. But without further ado, I'm going to invite Vivek up to take us through Trumpism, the state of US politics.
Thank you, Vish. Wonderful introduction. The mention of Catalyst is actually quite important because Catalyst was launched by myself and a historian named Robert Brenner, who's very well known in anybody who reads The Transition to Capitalism. Also in debates around development, because Brenner's work was very influential in understanding the agrarian question as part of development. We launched Catalyst partly because, in spite of Trump, and in spite of the conjuncture that we're in, which seems so worrying, we see this as not just as an important, but a potentially very promising moment for the left. And we felt a need to have a journal committed to a left and a working class perspective, but bringing to it a kind of a more theoretical and strategic orientation than Jacobin was doing, which is much more interventionist and much more political and conjunctural in its approach. So as Vish said, we do very much see the journal as a journal of the global left, not of the American left, and in particular of the global south. So we hope that not only will it be read in South Africa, but that also friends and comrades down here will contribute to it as well. Now, you might feel it odd to hear me say that this is a moment of some hope and opportunity for the left, because we are, of course, as Vish said, in the middle of what might be called the Trump moment. I don't think there's something called Trumpism just yet. And in fact, in my view, Trump could be the last gasp of a dying order. What I'd like to give today is a perspective on why there's some reason to bring this perspective to Trump. But the only way we can do that, it seems to me, is not just by locating him in the broader trajectory of American politics, but by locating him in the trajectory of politics in the advanced capitalist world more generally. So what I want to do is start by placing the rise and the victory of Trump in the context of European and American politics, and mention how that he exemplifies broader trends that one is seeing everywhere in the Atlantic world. And then come back to the American scene to try to work out what is particular to not only Trump, but the current moment, and by the moment I mean literally the last 3 or 4 weeks in American politics, to have some perspective on where we might go from here as well. Now, as those of you who follow US politics probably know, 18 months ago, everybody thought the 2016 election was sewn up. Indeed, 3 years ago, everyone thought it was sewn up. It was supposed to have been an epical battle between two dynasties. The Bush dynasty, represented by the younger brother Jeb, and the Clinton dynasty, in which the matriarch, Hillary, who would take the presidency perhaps, but keep the seat warm for her daughter who was now waiting in the wings, and you would have the Game of Thrones being played out in the United States. This was true 2 years ago, it was true 18 months ago. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, you see these two completely marginal figures emerge in Bernie Sanders on the one hand and Trump on the other, and roil the entire electoral process. Now, the defeat of not just Hillary, but of the other dynasties and the establishment in the Republican Party is something to contemplate, and we will in a minute. But the important point is that it's part of a larger phenomenon that has been unfolding across the Atlantic world over the past 3 years, which is a phenomenon of what one might call an electoral rebellion against the mainstream political order. This has happened in Spain with the rise of Podemos. It's happened in England with the rise of Corbyn. It's happening in France with the astonishing performance of Mélenchon. It happened earlier in Greece in what was supposed to be a rebellion with Syriza. The only place where you see stability right now is Germany, the heartland of European capitalism. But all around it is swirling something that has the bearing of an electoral rebellion. The Trump phenomenon is part of this wider phenomenon. And I want to consider what's driving this whole thing before we come to the specificities of the American scene. And in order to understand what's driving it, I think we have to contemplate two processes. One that one might call a long-term process that's been underway, and then another medium-term process. These are the two, I think, phenomena that are behind this sudden crisis of the mainstream all across the Atlantic world. The long-term phenomenon has to do, putting it very pithily, it has to do with the decline and final collapse of the Social Democratic Party. And by that I mean the parties that came out of the Second and Third Internationals in Europe, which gained power starting in the 1930s, moving through the 40s and 50s, and by the early 60s had established what we now know as the welfare state across the European mainland. These parties, coming out of working class movements, being initially mobilizing parties, rooted in trade unions, rooted in the working class, and committed to some variety of an anti-capitalist perspective. These were the parties that had been responsible for decades in organizing a mass base for themselves in the working class, mobilizing it, pushing against the limits that capital imposed on it, and extracting concessions in the form of all the policies that we associate with the welfare state. Now, while they had started as these kinds of mobilizational parties, by the 1950s, they had already started to morph into something quite different. Already by the 1950s, these parties were turning on their way to turning from mobilizing agitational parties of the working class to becoming essentially what we would call managerial parties. Technocratic parties whose main goal was to maintain growth, but an orientation towards the working class, which was more towards controlling it, managing it, maintaining industrial peace, so that capital and labor could be brought to the table in some kind of political exchange. Labor would give up militancy and industrial unrest in exchange for higher wages, in exchange for better policies, etc. Well, of course, this had an effect on the parties as well. The parties quite rapidly, by the 1960s, have become parties mainly of technocrats, economists, of the upper middle class, and less geared towards mobilizing its base. Now, as long as growth was healthy in Europe and in the United States, these parties could continue with the, as it were, boilerplate commitment and self-identification as working class parties. This was true even of the Democrats. The Democrats were the most right-wing of all the social democratic, all the labor parties in the advanced capitalist world. Indeed, they never really ceased being a corporate party. It's just that for a period from the late 30s all the way into the late 70s, they did have to create a space for the organized sector of the American working class, the AFL-CIO, especially its more left-wing proponents like Walter Reuther through the UAW. The Democrats took on the appearance of their cousins in Europe of being a social democratic party. And what allowed all of these formations to continue with this self-identification was that as long as growth was healthy, as long as profits were rolling in, as long as economic development continued apace, the social surplus kept expanding at a rate that allowed some kind of redistribution, either through collective bargaining or through welfare, the welfare state, some kind of redistribution towards the poor. But this, as it were, the managerial face of the parties, more committed to maintaining labor peace, became more and more visible as the conditions for economic growth deteriorated. So that by the 1980s and 90s, as growth slowed down in the United States, you saw the Democrats very quickly emerging as a conservative, indeed as a neoliberal party. Because when the choice came between continuing with the representation given to labor versus the priority that has to be given to capital and profits, the choice very quickly was made towards capital and profits. In Europe, the slowdown came a little bit later, it came in the 1990s, but by the early 2000s you saw, again, the socialist parties, the labor parties in Europe, not only converging on a kind of conservative economic agenda, but after the crisis of 2000 and after the crisis of 2007, the worst austerity measures in Europe were all being implemented and doled out by parties that were either socialist or labor or social democratic. So that by the mid-2000s, the very distinction between the center-right and the social democratic left had by and large collapsed. On economic matters and matters of state, there was now an incredible convergence between the historic left and the historic right. Now, as far as the European and the American working class goes, what this meant was that on the key questions that affected their material interests, black or white, male or female, on the key questions that affected their ability to get jobs, their wages, their access to health care, their access to housing, on all those questions now, both parties were presenting them with the same platform. Or putting it differently, they saw very little difference in who it was that was coming into power in one administration after the other. In the United States, the one consequence has been an abiding cynicism about the political system. And as many of you might know, the national disgrace of the United States is that only about half the electorate votes. And the half that does not vote is the poorer half. And poll after poll has shown the major reason that they do not vote is that they feel they have no one to vote for. That is to say, they feel there is no party that represents them in the political system. Well, you've seen actually declining rates of electoral participation in Europe as well over the past 25 years. Indeed, over the past 10 years in the European political science, the biggest question has been addressing the implosion of political parties in Europe so that they no longer serve the function that they historically did, which is being attached to identifiable interests and serving those identifiable interests. They've become what's called cartel parties. This is a fancy word for saying they've become parties of capital all over Europe. So by the early 2000s, now when we look back, what we see is there was a crisis brewing in that for the working class across the Atlantic world, there was now a basic mainstream political menu that was offered to them in which there were some variations around minor themes, but no longer the ideological programmatic divide that one historically saw between parties of the right and parties of the left. Well, not surprisingly, what this meant was, in the last 4 to 5 years, we have seen, for the first time in about 4 decades, a rebellion against the mainstream order. This is what we are witnessing right now across the board. I want to be precise about this. Until now, I've been saying it's a rebellion against the mainstream. A lot of people agree with that. What do we mean by mainstream? In much of the left, and certainly in the journalistic core, it's been interpreted as a shift to the right. And this is where Trump comes in. This is where Le Pen comes in France. This is where UKIP comes in England. All of these are seen as indications of a shift to the right, either because white workers are racist, or because they're frustrated, or something like that. Now, there's no doubt that the last 15 years have seen a strengthening of right-wing parties, a strengthening even of far-right parties. But at the same time, it's impossible to ignore that as soon as candidates such as Sanders or Corbyn or Mélenchon have emerged, what we've also seen is a sudden decline in the support base of these right-wing parties. And what that tells us is that what we're witnessing is not the right per se, but what we're witnessing is a working class across these countries engaged in a two-sided, two-step political rejection. First of all, the rejection of what they seem to be a uniformly conservative political establishment. And secondly, voting for anybody who they see as speaking directly to their economic, to their material interests. And in the implosion, or I should say in the wholesale retreat of the traditional left, for the last 15 years, it was the right that was giving the French, the British, the American working class a conceptual vocabulary, some kind of theoretical framework through which they could interpret their condition. Now, it was a terrible framework, and of course it was wrong. But the main thing is this: it wasn't so much a deep-seated cultural hostility to people of color, or a deep-seated xenophobia, although in some sections of the class, of course, that's there, and it's always there. It was more workers saying there needs to be some political entity out there that will tell us and explain to us, first of all, where our jobs are going, why they're going, why our benefits are being cut, and who will assure us that they're going to do something about it. If you go back to the electoral campaigns of the past 5 years, what was Hillary Clinton saying? What was the British Labour Party saying? What were the French Socialists saying? Essentially what they were saying was, stay the course. Nothing fundamentally wrong there's nothing fundamentally wrong about the economic model we've been using. There's nothing fundamentally wrong about either of the parties. There are some mistakes that have been made, there's some corrections that need to be made, but right now, all we need to do is manage the system better, not do anything fundamental to change the system. Now, what was saw, therefore, in the shift to the right was an inchoate lurch towards any political force that would say, no, there's something actually deeply wrong about this. The second, Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, and others come to the scene, you see an explosion to the left of the kind nobody had anticipated. And it seems to me unequivocally the case that this lurch to the left is for the same reasons that they were looking for some kinds of answers from the right. That is to say, they wanted to have somebody who promises to fight for them, not simply tinker around the system. Promises to take on the entire system, doesn't simply promise to manage it better. So what we therefore saw in the last 2 elections, it seems to me, was not so much the rise of Trumpism. It's actually the first opening for the left that we have seen since '68. The difference between 1968 and now, though, is this. Back at that time, there were still forces within the social democratic left, and indeed in the revolutionary left, that had some kind of vision, and which gave ordinary voters and also the trade unions an organized presence and some kind of organizational capacity to fight for its interests. And that's why the last time we saw a genuine radicalization of social democracy was in the era of '68 to '72. Because at that time, not only was there a rebellion against the mainstream order, that rebellion had a base in the organized sections of the working class. Not just, by the way, in the global north. You saw this across the global south as well. In Mexico, in India, in Chile, you saw this, and it's an astounding phenomenon. I think since 1789, we've never seen anything quite like this. But the fact is that there are two commonalities. There's a commonality between 68 and now, which is a rebellion against the mainstream political order. But the difference is, today the rebellion is entirely electoral. It has no presence in organized politics yet. And that makes it easier to mistake it for something other than an opening, I think, for the left. Much less so than in 68, although I think the characteristics are quite the same. Hence, what we are seeing, I think, is really more accurately what you call it the Bernie moment, or the Corbyn moment, not so much the Trump moment. Now, let's examine this in a little bit more detail. How is it that Trump comes to power? Well, we saw that in the American primaries, both political parties witnessed a very similar process going on, which is two relatively fringe candidates suddenly emerging and very rapidly displacing the anointed mainstream candidates. The reason they emerge is that both candidates are seen by the electorate as representing something that is against each of these parties. So Trump is voted for not because he's a big businessman, because he's a big capitalist, he represents forces of the right, he's got big money behind it. He's voted for because he's seen as bucking these trends. It's something, an irony in American politics, where a multimillionaire is seen as a maverick, as somebody who's a revolutionary. But there's no doubt that they voted for him because they saw that the party hated him. But secondly, they voted for him not because he's a racist, but in spite of it. That is to say, they voted for him on his economic platform, on his promise of jobs, on his promise of revisiting trade treaties, on his promise of rebuilding the infrastructure and providing jobs through that. Steve Bannon was right in that the gamble was that his economic nationalism would bring the working class and the voters to him. Now, it's true that the racism did appeal to certain parts of the electorate, but it wasn't the reason they voted for him. And polls after the election showed that on racial issues and on cultural issues, he was much less popular than he was on economic issues. Now, Bernie Sanders is voted for exactly for that same reason. Not only did they vote for him for the same reason, what poll after poll showed was, had Sanders run against Trump, had Sanders won the Democratic primary, there's a very high likelihood that he actually would have beaten Trump. Hillary Clinton has the distinction of losing to probably the weakest candidate the Republicans have ever put up. It's entirely possible that if Democrats had run a mannequin or a garden animal, they might have won. Hillary Clinton's achievement was to lose to this man because she was seen as such an unalloyed representative of the corporate right and the corporate interest behind the Democratic Party. Now, today, at this moment, the most popular politician in America is not Hillary Clinton, is not Donald Trump, it's Bernie Sanders. The most popular politician with black Americans is Bernie Sanders. The most popular politician with women is Bernie Sanders. The most popular politician with the electorate as a whole is Bernie Sanders. In the wake of his defeat, the lesson was the more people saw him, the more they liked him. And the more people saw Hillary Clinton, the less they liked her. In England today, the most popular candidate is Corbyn. Not only is he the most popular candidate, odds are, if there's an election in the next 2 years, anything more than 2 years is hard to predict in politics. If there's an election in the next 2 years, Corbyn wins. How does one interpret this? How does one bring this in line with the idea that the American and the British working class is irredeemably racist? That it voted for them because of a deep-seated xenophobia, a deep-seated racism. I think it's very hard to jive with these facts. I think the most consistent way to interpret it is that they voted for him in spite of his xenophobia and racism, not because of it. And I think we'll see more evidence of this as time goes along. In no way does this minimize the presence of racism within the working class. It does, however, deny a very popular conception and trope that's out there that white workers are and have been historically opposed to the plight of the betterment of or impervious to the condition of black workers. I don't think that's the case. One final point. In county after county where Trump won, these are the same counties where Obama had won, not once but twice. It's very hard to render consistent with the idea that these are racist white workers. They voted for Obama twice. They voted for Trump in spite of this, the white nationalism, therefore not because of it. So it seems to me then that what Trump is giving us is probably the last gasp, if we play our cards right, the last gasp of the neoliberal order. Everything that I've said so far suggests this electoral revolt against the mainstream, let's give it a name, it's actually an electoral revolt against neoliberalism. It is an electoral revolt against 20 years of austerity, against 40 years of no wage growth, against 25 to 30 years of very little job growth, against decades of scaling back of the welfare state, in other words, of declining standards of living, and on the one hand, with enormous enrichment of the top parts of the population on another. What is remarkable is that we went 45 years without any such rebellion. In the history of capitalism, since 1789, we've never had a period this long in the capitalist world where there was not a major upheaval of the working class or the peasantry in the working class. If you just count from 1789 onward, every 20 to 25 years, there has been a major rebellion. This is the longest we've gone. Probably the only period that compares at all is after the revolutions of 1848 in England, where you went about 35 years or so without any kind of organized presence. We went now 40 to 45 years. Considering that, in fact, not only were we overdue, it's still a pretty tepid rebellion. It's going to grow, in my opinion. And it's going to grow in a way that we've not seen before. Because the organized left has always been the institutions through which these rebellions have come, and that organized left right now in the Atlantic world is largely dead. And that's why we're seeing this taking an electoral form. Okay, that's the preamble into what the preamble. That's the description of what the general process was. Let me now say something about where I think Trump is right now, and the Trumpism is, as it were, right now. As a president, I think Trump has probably had the shortest honeymoon in American history. Right now, at this moment, the Trump administration is in political freefall. Every single platform that he ran on, whether economic or whether cultural or national, every single one of them has failed. He's failed to enact a new health legislation. He's failed on his infrastructure bill. He hasn't even tried on his tax bill. And he has retreated wholesale on all of his trade promises. Trump is now actually embracing NAFTA, whereas he once promised that NAFTA would be dismantled in his administration. He promised to put in a new healthcare law. All he says now is, we can't do that. We're just going to squeeze Obamacare until it dies. If you look at the first 100 days or so of his administration, all of his achievements have been negative. That is to say, all he's done is dismantle existing legislation. He has not been able to put forward a single new legislation that he promised. Secondly, in the wake of Charlottesville, in the wake of the march of the white nationalists in Charlottesville, Trump is now entirely rejected by the American ruling class. Now there's an important point here. On many parts of the left, there's a semi-hysteria going on. That Charlottesville, the march by the white nationalists, is just the beginning. Okay. We shouldn't underestimate these forces. I think there will be attempts at other marches. I think there are going to be attempts by people, by forces within American civil society that have historically, in the last 20 years, 30 years, gone and hid under rocks, had not had the guts to make their presence visible. I think they're coming out because they think this presidency is giving them a certain amount of space. No doubt about that. And there's no doubt that we'll actually see more such events. The question is whether these events, A, betoken a snowballing rise of right-wing forces, and more expansively, whether it betokens perhaps a shift towards some kind of, let's just use the word, fascism in the United States. I think the answer to both is emphatically no. There's an important reason why. First of all, fascism is an extremely expensive system to maintain. I don't mean expensive monetarily, I mean expensive politically. Essentially, you are full frontally attacking not just the working class, but the entire enfranchised section of your population, including very powerful elements of the political elite. Historically, such systems have only come around when there is a massive threat to the system from below. In the United States today, there's no threat from anyone. Yeah, there's this incipient, what I'm calling an electoral rebellion, but it doesn't threaten any fundamental interest just yet. Secondly, the proof is right here before us. The moment Trump presented his weak-kneed, his tepid admonishment to these white nationalists, the response the next day was for the few members of the business community who were still willing to work with him to resign from his business advisory council. Now, Trump was already loathed by the Republican establishment, and that's another way of saying he was loathed by the funders behind the Republican establishment because of the unorthodox economic policies and because of his awful personality, frankly. He was already loathed by them, and he was already pretty much on his own, politically isolated. Now, what happened in the first 100 days was what always happens. Once you secure power, power is a magnet. So, of course, some sections of capital come to you. Some sections of the intelligentsia come to you. We were witnessing that. People saying, okay, maybe we can work with him. What Charlottesville has done is that it has completely isolated him even within elite circles. The reason it's isolated him is that there is no section, no significant section of the American ruling class that has any interest in a shift towards the far right or in a shift towards fascism. And the reason for that is simple. The system has worked fantastically well for them the past 30 years. They are now making profits hand over fist. The trade union movement is on its back. Both political parties belong to them. The intelligentsia is busy bickering amongst itself. The liberal intelligentsia is hated by everybody, including me. And that should matter a lot. They have nothing to fear. There's no reason for them to try to transform the system. What Trump is doing is unnecessarily roiling the waters, unnecessarily calling attention to the mailed fist of the American ruling class, and therefore Trump is now considered an albatross by them around their neck. So what we are witnessing then is that not only is his administration already kind of a lame duck. In the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in this magazine called The Hill, in all the political newspapers, there's open talk of Trump being challenged in the next presidential primaries, the Republican primaries. And there's open discussion of who it might be that will challenge him in the primaries. Now you must understand in American politics, that never happens. The last time that happened was for Lyndon B. Johnson in 1960. He decided to run because he knew there was going to be a challenge to him in the Democratic Party. That is, in 50 years we haven't seen this happen. So now, as far as Trump himself goes, therefore, in my view, he's completely isolated. That does not mean that the right is in retreat. It simply means that Trump and the crazy policies that he represented are in retreat, and the maniacal forces that he represented are in retreat. Behind him, of course, stands the Republican establishment with people like Kasich, with people like Ted Cruz, with the people like Paul Ryan, who 10 years ago were considered borderline insane because of how far right they were. Ted Cruz is the Tea Party candidate. So the fact that Trump loses doesn't mean that the left wins. And let me now lay out the challenge that we have before us in the next few years. Even if Trump loses, it does not mean that neoliberalism is over. As I said, this is a revolt against neoliberalism, but that it is so far purely electoral in form. And so far it has not managed to topple the forces that have been imposing neoliberalism over the past 40 years. And in particular, if in 2020 Bernie Sanders does not run again, and he's given no explicit indication that he will run again, the Democratic Party does not have any candidate that is ideologically committed to dismantling neoliberalism. Not even Elizabeth Sanders. She's probably the closest, but she has not yet come out far enough to take that position. And in Sanders' campaign, when she had the opportunity to back him, she very conspicuously refused to do so. She very conspicuously remained on the sidelines. Now, that might indicate an ambivalence towards neoliberalism, but it might also indicate a lack of political fortitude, a lack of commitment to an agenda which she secretly supports, like the Sanders agenda, but is unwilling to take on her party politically. But that means that in 2020, even if she runs, we shouldn't expect that she will take on. And make no mistake, any Democrat that runs on an anti-neoliberal agenda will have to take on the party. The party is fundamentally, hand over fist committed to neoliberalism, and the most recent pronouncements that they've laid out, the most recent platform that they've laid out, the most recent political meetings that they've made, all of this clear indications they have no intention of retreating from their historic commitments to a corporate agenda. So what we have then is not only a Republican Party that, after Trump, will try to push forward everything that it's been doing the last 40 years because it sees Trump as an accident, but also a Democratic Party that has refused to learn a single lesson from what, from their standpoint, was something close to a debacle in 2016. Hence, if what I'm saying is accurate, that this is an opening for the left, that opening isn't going to push itself into an anti-neoliberal or a post-neoliberal agenda. It is simply an occasion in which political forces, if they manage to get their act together, some small slivers of the left inside the Democratic Party, but all the social movements outside it, if they are not able to move forward with it, we are going to remain stuck. Because there's no doubt that ideologically, neoliberalism is dead. It is no longer seen as viable or desirable by any significant section of the American electorate or of the Atlantic electorate. Ideologically, therefore, this whole TINA notion, there is no other alternative, we must embrace neoliberalism, that's no longer accepted by the electorate. What they do not yet have, however, is a clear alternative in the United States. In Jeremy Corbyn, they do. And that's why most people expect Corbyn to win the next election. But God lives in the US. And it's not going to be enough for its satellites to have an electoral victory. The world still revolves around the United States. So those of us who live there, but also those of you who are outside, it is important not just to observe, but to participate in any way possible. In my opinion, the 2020 election is going to be the most important election probably since 68 or 72 in the United States. It is going to tell us which way the political winds are shifting. We'll see if Sanders runs, I don't know what happens. But by 2020, what we're going to see is both political parties regrouping around the same agenda that they were pushing in 2016. And it's going to be up to the electorate and those few political figures and political forces that are trying to push forward to try to upset that apple cart once again, the way they did coming out of nowhere in 2016 and 17. Thank you.
Okay. So let's take some questions, comments. Go first. 1, 2, 3.
Thanks, Vivek.
Can you tell me your name? Yeah,
sorry. Warren McGregor. And I work for a unit in sociology, the Global Labour University. So again, the responsibility falls on the organized and other sections of the working class to create a world transformed, I guess. So therefore, in the context of the United States at present, what is the future of the working class in general, the organized working class in particular, both its more traditional and newer forms of organization that may have sprung up in the last while? Thank you.
Okay. I'm Robert from Center for Applied Legal Studies. I'm environmental justice relations. So you described it correctly that the recent rebellion is an electoral rebellion, where we actually have seen it played out in actually electing a government in Greece. It actually failed for many reasons, in part because of Greece's position in Europe, in the European economy, but also possibly due to the lack of really strong working class organizations that can actually drive a left agenda. What you've also said is that, and what's also clear is that in US and the UK, organized forces of the left are incredibly weak. So on that basis, to the extent that the electoral extent that there is a progressive candidate and the progressive candidate wins, say, in the Dems in 2020, would you predict that based on this dynamics of the social landscape, that government will also fail due to the absence of social forces, and also assuming that within a 4-year period it's difficult to really reconstitute a really organized and militant left?
Jesse Harbour. You rightly note that Trump's failed to deliver on any part of his platform, but one place he's had conspicuous success is the appointment of federal judges, at which I believe he's been appointing them at twice the rate that Obama did. What does that mean for even the best case left-wing victory in 2020 and politics in the decades after?
Let me answer. I'm going to take 3 at a time. Otherwise, questions get lost. I don't want to skip anything. Let me start with Warren's question. Yeah, I mean, that is the most important question in many ways for all of us. Where the organized working class in the U.S. is right now is either completely compromised politically or so beaten down and so lacking in confidence that it's very, very afraid to take up the cudgels. So just the last 2 weeks you saw that Richard Trumka, who is in one of Trump's councils, Trumka is the leader of the AFL-CIO. Trumka is now criticizing him, saying maybe we should rethink this. And the question is, what are you doing in his council? What on earth? What are you doing sitting at Donald Trump's table? Now Trumka, for those of you who know something about American politics, when he was second in command and rose to second in command 20 years ago, he was considered the fire-breathing radical. He was considered the one who would breathe life into the U.S. labor movement again. He did nothing of the kind. And the reason is actually quite simple. The AFL-CIO has failed to lead any significant organizing drives in probably half a century now. It doesn't even know how to do it, if you ask me. Its main strategy, every major union in the U.S. the last 30 years has been to grow by raiding other unions. So the internalization of a top-down union strategy, of a strategy where the UAW actually has officially said, we do not believe in class struggle. We are in a partnership with the auto companies. Each of us has a stake in it. They call themselves stakeholders. The owners are stakeholders, we are stakeholders, and we work together for the betterment of our workers and for the betterment of our profits. The old-fashioned description of this is business union. So the whole ideology of business unionism has so corrupted the leadership of the AFL-CIO that I do not see them as playing any significant role in this until they're pushed to. Now, on the other hand, in smaller unions, in locals, or even in the, say, larger nationals like the nurses union, you do see real signs of life, real radicalism. What's happened is, ironically, in many of these unions over the past 30 years, there was a feeling that they were so isolated and marginalized in the wider political scene that if they took up militant struggles, they would not be able to elicit the support of the wider community in the cities in which they're going on strike or in the counties. So that there was a worry that if they asked their membership to risk a strike, they would be left hung out to dry. And so there was a regime of kind of concession after concession to the bosses as a response. One of the things that's happened in the past 2 years is that the Bernie Sanders campaign gave an enormous lift to the spirits and the confidence of rank-and-file organizers and the more left-wing unions. And in fact, some of these left-wing unions are working actively with Sanders right now. Either, we don't know where it's going, whether it's going, I mean, it's maybe behind closed doors they know, either towards a revitalization of his campaign or to drive a wedge through the Democratic Party between left and right. But the interesting thing is, it's taken developments outside the unions to embolden them to the point where they can start taking up organizing and militant campaigns again. So in my view, it's probably unrealistic to expect that in 2020, the existing organized unions, the major labor confederations, will play a leading role in rejecting what the two parties are giving them. It's probably going to have to come from outside through social movements of various kinds, or through the electorate again, to give them the wherewithal to do so. The challenge is that until the US working class does get massively involved, even the electoral rebellion will be limited in its scope and in its potential. Because at the end of the day, power in capitalism doesn't reside in the state. Power resides in the economy, where profits are being made. And until the donors that are backing both of these parties and have been behind them for the last 100 years, until those donors, those corporate donors, are themselves worried about militancy, about their profits, about the stability of their regimes, they will continue to veto or try to block anything that a purely electoral campaign puts on the table. So I think you've raised, that's why I said, and Warren, you've raised the central question and the conundrum over here. Now, this is all US specific. In England, I think it's going to be a different scene. Now, Robert's point about Greece is, again, also absolutely right. Greece failed, and it was primarily, though not in any way fundamentally, an electoral rebellion. Because as we all know, for 5 years, Greece was being roiled by labor actions as well, by general strikes, by mass civic disobedience, by mass involvement in politics. So it was something far beyond what we've seen in the US, but of course it was not a working class led rebellion. And I think your surmise is correct over there. And it failed. Now, two questions. A, why did it fail? And B, what might it alert us to about the potential for the United States? Well, the full story will not be out for a while. And Varoufakis' recent book doesn't help matters, because it's mostly about how great he is. But I think a couple of things are reasonable inferences we can make. The first one is that it was a tremendously, handicapping of their own power. The fact that Tsipras and the leadership of Syriza ruled out right from the start breaking from the European Union. Once they announced to themselves, to their cadre, and to Germany that we are not going to break with the Union, the bankers and Germany understood that Greece has no leverage against them, and that they can turn the screws pretty much as hard as they want. Okay, so why do they not want to break with the Union? I mean, this is where we're going to have to wait until the histories come out. The official position is they thought that there would be social forces in place to push the EU in a more left-wing direction, much the same as Lenin and Trotsky waiting in 1918 for the German Revolution, which would create an opening for the Russians to have breathing space. I find that impossible to believe. It takes a level of naivete about European politics that is simply, in my mind, phantasmagorical to think that the leadership of Syriza actually thought that the Socialist Party in France might create some breathing space for them against the bankers. It seems to me more an ideological commitment they had coming from some sort of view about what the EU should be. But regardless, the refusal to at least contemplate leaving the EU massively reduced whatever leverage they had. But the second was this. I think that Syriza simply failed in its political obligation to fight, even fighting within the EU. So not only did it fail to prepare its base for what would be a long and bloody battle against the Troika, they also reneged on their democratic promise on something as simple as the referendum, which meant that they gave the other side a full view that these people are not going to fight us. And whatever leverage they might have had was dissipated overnight. For the United States, I think, first of all, this is a big lesson. Whoever comes to power is going to have to understand that the entire American ruling class is going to line up against them. And to his credit, Sanders understands that. So Sanders, unlike any of the European Social Democrats, when he was questioned pointedly in his primary campaign, how will you pass any of this legislation when Congress is in the hands of the very corporate donors who you are railing against? He said something no Blairite has said. He said something not even Tsipras said. He said, the only way my policies will be passed if there are millions of people in the streets. Because the only thing these politicians will listen to other than their corporate donors is a threat coming from below. So first of all, the United States, whoever wins, if they try to pass such an agenda, has to know that it's going to involve a massive attack by the forces of the right and by the capitalist class. But secondly, understand, this is the US, it's not Greece. It is a lot harder on a small peripheral country to try to pass anti-capitalist legislation than it is for the country in which God lives. So the US will have to face not an attack from the outside, but an internal political crisis, which is a different kettle of fish. So take something like healthcare. In my mind, it's actually going to be one of the easier legislations to pass if you have political pressure coming from below. The reason I think this is that when Obama came to power in 2008, the pharmaceuticals, the insurance companies were ready to make major concessions. And that was Obama. And that was simply because he was the first president in 35 years to put healthcare and national healthcare back on the agenda. And it received such a response from the electorate. It was so terrifying to these companies that they were already willing to make concessions. It took Obama's genius as a politician to figure out how to snatch defeat from the jaws of that potential victory. It was Obama's complete fidelity to a corporate agenda so that when he had his first national meeting around healthcare with all his advisors, he said in his memo, everything goes, you can discuss anything you want except one thing, which is single-payer healthcare. I will not consider that. And the moment the insurance companies and the pharmaceuticals saw this, they took back every promise they made for concessions, and they essentially said, let us write the bill, which is what they did. If Sanders or someone like him were to win, and it was on the back of a massive mobilization, I don't think passing something like a single-payer bill would result in the kind of attack you saw in Greece. It would bring about all sorts of, I think, political objections, but it wouldn't have an attack like what we saw in Greece. And that's something you can build on. But yeah, it's going to be hard. The third question about judges. All Trump is doing here is continuing a very long agenda in which Obama also was part of in putting right-wing judges in the courts. What I can say is, historically, judges have always been conservative in the United States. They've never been any important linchpin for progressive change. So even though it's disheartening, and even though it's something one would rather see not happen, you can pretty much expect that whatever forces for change, whatever pushes for change, progressive change there are, judges are not going to play a very positive role in that. So they can do that, and they've always done.
My name is Philip Mann. I'm at the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, and I loved your precise and lucid analysis of the situation in America. I just wondered about the underplaying or downplaying of race in the argument. And I wonder what you could do to the argument to bring in Black Lives Matter, which besides the electoral revolution, there's a whole turmoil going on in race relations, and what is arguably the most racist society in existence. So the kind of argument you make that it is not in the interests of the establishment of capital to have an exacerbation of race relations, to have more incidents of what happened at Charlottesville, rests on a belief in a certain nature of what American democracy is, very similar to what in Turkey and India liberal elites believe, right? That it was not in India's interests to have Hindu fundamentalism, and the Indian left ignored caste just as much as the American left does not seem to be engaging with race. So I wonder what it would do to bring race into the argument.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Emmanuel. Thank you very much for your...
Sorry, your name?
Emmanuel. Yeah, thanks for your presentation. I think I'm just going to slightly kind of add to that, but my kind of question was, your whole kind of analysis, that's, you come from the kind of class, working class kind of analysis. We have seen the last 30, 40 years was the theoretical developments in terms of looking at the complexity of how things work in society. I'm not where cultural studies, post-cultural work has been complex works around here. And I'm worried that you still are talking about that one when even the empirical evidence doesn't prove that.
Prove what?
Prove the fact that the working class is not there. And which working class are you talking about? What is the working class you're talking? I think that's very important. I think in his case, he's mentioned the case of racism, and we've seen that one again and again. So what I'm saying is there a different kind of thing that we can pick, a different paradigm to explain what's happening? Is there a different, not the one that starts from working class from mid-19th century or 18th century, but can we go back maybe to the 15th century? 500, 600 years of history of slavery, a whole lot of things have been happening there. We haven't explored that one. So I think you come from a sociological analysis, therefore you pick in that one. So I want you to explore that one. Second point, connected to that one, is the issue on when you're talking about the social democratic model of Western Europe, the German, Scandinavian. I think it seems to me it was a serious different model. It was a model that was developed, with the ordo-liberal Austrian school in early 20th century, and their idea was of managing a different kind of economy. So, but you're coming from a particular angle, therefore you're totally marginalizing that one, and you're saying it's managerial. But I think I'm content to say it's totally different version altogether. It's a different version. So you universalizing, and therefore again, I think we fall into that trap of using universal analysis and therefore not seeing things for what they are. The third point is...
Whoa. We should have said, you really should... So now I said I'll answer 3 questions at a time. Now you're taking up all 3 questions.
Because that's connected to the first one. You were
Everything's
talking
connected.
about working class, but actually, in the case of John Corbyn, and I think in the case of also the American left, whatever, most of the voting was coming from the young group, students. So again, that's a different kind of demography. And again, that is telling us a different story. We need to see a different way of looking how things are working. And I think,
Thank you for that. Samantha?
No, I'm going to have to, because these are 4 questions already. Sam, I'm going to come back to you. And for future, I would just request that people confine themselves to 1 question, because it makes it very hard to take all these up. Because I'm going to have to take up all of Emmanuel's questions, which are a lot now. But let me start with Dilip's question. First of all, the most racist country on earth is India. The US doesn't even come close, Dilip. And I know it's fashionable to keep saying this, but we have enormous data on this. The US actually is, on race relations, in terms of cultural attitudes, one of the more advanced countries. And there's a reason for this. The US has had a civil rights movement, and it civilized the country to an extent. The Indian middle class is the most racist formation on earth. I don't know how somebody coming from India can say the US. Okay, so let's keep the rhetoric aside on that stuff, right? Now, did I leave race out? Of course not. I don't know, maybe you weren't listening. I just said that race played a very important role in Trump's coming to power and the rise of the far right. I did, however, say that race was not the reason they were elected. If you have an alternative data set, please let me know. That it was, all the evidence indicates they were elected from some part of the electorate because of the racism, but overwhelmingly it was in spite of it, not because of it. Okay, let's take up BLM. If you are committed to the Black Lives Matter agenda, is that different from a class agenda as well? Not if you take it seriously. What does Black Lives Matter fundamentally ask for? An end to mass incarceration, a decent urban neighborhoods, healthcare, jobs for Black Americans. How are you going to pursue that simply on a racial agenda? You cannot pursue that except through a massive jobs program. You cannot pursue it except through national health care. You cannot pursue it except through massively publicly subsidized housing. And who's going to get that for you? Other than poor blacks. I see this in talk after talk after talk. When people see me talking about class, they assume whiteness. And I will put it to you, what on earth induces you to do that? The majority of blacks in America are working class. It is not me, my friend, it is you. When I say a working class agenda, that of course means fundamentally an agenda that is in the interest of the vast majority of blacks. And you cannot even begin to address the very same issues that the BLM, Black Lives Matter, is bringing up, unless you put working class blacks at the front of that agenda. And like it or not, they're going to have to work with working class blacks, simply because of the numbers here. The point of my talk, and this is really important because South Africa is getting sucked into this class versus race stuff. after the most vibrant black working class movement the world has ever seen, of thinking that class somehow ignores race. You start thinking this, your conception of race politics becomes wealthy black politics. You cannot address these issues that are the issues that the vast majority of black people in South Africa or the United States are embroiled in unless you take up the issue of capital and capitalism, which brings me to Emmanuel. Emmanuel, you said I start with the working class. I don't. I start with the problem of capital. Capital is the force around which power revolves in a capitalist society. This is why it's hard to go back 500 years. Because 500 years ago, the social forces that dominated and organized politics were fundamentally different than the social forces that dominate and organize politics today. I mean, I think the motivation behind what you were saying was understandable, which is that the history of capitalism is interlaced with the history of racial oppression. It starts with slavery. You're absolutely right about that. But I do not think it's possible to understand the evolution of how black and African lives were incorporated into the modern order if you abstract away from capital. No European enslaved Africans because they were black. They enslaved them because they offered an opportunity to make money. And therefore in Eastern Europe, they also enslaved whites. In England, they also enslaved or semi-enslaved Irishmen. What they were after was an opportunity to make money, around which they built a discourse of race. This is my view. If you do not believe this, if you do not accept this, you must ask yourselves the question, why does racism exist? You only have two answers. Either it's genetically encoded among whites, or it's an ideology and a form of social oppression around which that they built up to benefit from it. But who was doing the benefiting? It was the wealthy. It was wealthy whites. So it seems to me that the starting point still needs to be capital, whether it's South Africa or whether it's Europe that we're talking about. And I do not think this avoids complexity. Again, there's this idea that race is complex, but class is simple. All abstractions are simple. Race is no more complex than class if you're simply talking about these two general categories. They become complex when you interlace them with other categories. And absolutely, I agree with you. All class analysis has to be interlaced with racial consideration, the issues of gender, absolutely. But not every analysis has to bring in everything. And since in modern society, we believe that it's the wealthy that control power, and they get their wealth from capital, that analysis has to in some way hinge upon the analysis of capitalism. Now, Emmanuel, you say that there needs to be an alternative framework that's considered, right? Of course, I fully agree. When that alternative framework is developed and it's brought forth for consideration, one will do it. But so far, the framework that I've seen that's most promising as a starting point and also as a general framework as one which is one that puts capital at the center of the framework, not to the exclusion of everything else, but as the organizing principle for modern society. I think even in South Africa today, it's very hard to avoid that conclusion. That's a very general answer. I'm sure it's not entirely satisfactory. But it's hard to give a more precise answer because the way you posed your question was also quite general. I'll say this as the final point. The third point you brought up was this issue of ordoliberalism. And you said that's very different from a managerial ethos. It's actually not. Ordoliberals were entirely committed to a management. What I mean by managerialism is your attitude towards labor is that it is to be fundamentally controlled and harnessed rather than unleashed. The ordoliberal philosophy was the following, that markets are to be left unregulated to capture, this was their view, to capture the dynamism of capitalism. So you don't try to have industrial policy, you don't try to have planning. You let people who control investment use that investment as they should see fit. So you don't do a lot of state intervention in the economy. What you do is when you make their profits, you redistribute it to the working class through social programs. But the question was, why should these managers, these capitalists, accept a state that takes away some of their income and redistributes it to the working class? There's only one condition. You promise them something in return. What you promised them in return was industrial peace. Okay, that's a managerial ethos. Ordoliberalism. Germany pioneered the technique of managerialism within social democracy. That was a natural consequence of ordoliberalism. It wasn't opposed to.
It's about the
Okay,
2006. I mean,
thank
the whole
you.
German,
Excuse me,
the unemployment
sorry,
at the
sir.
height of the crisis was less than 8%. So it's a different version, and I think I still contend, you know, there was an institutional part of the ordoliberalism in terms of how they manage. I'm not approving that one, but it was a different version than what you want to put it as too marginal and just managerial. It survived it. What the
Excuse me, it's
I
kind
guess
of
I
a
just don't
conversation.
understand
It's
that.
kind of a
Maybe
conversation.
afterwards we can go.
Let's be fair to others who want to engage in the conversation. So Sam?
I had one point and one question. Is that all right?
Yeah.
The point is about Corbyn. I agree with your general analysis about polarisation, so I don't want to repeat it. I think just on Corbyn, lots of people say it's just young people voted for him because he promised to abolish tuition fees. And I think we shouldn't buy into this at all.
Oh, I forgot that point. I'm glad you're taking it up.
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
I mean, it's very commonly said, and it's really not true. It's not true of young people. I think young people voted for many reasons and were against austerity in general, you know, a big picture. So I don't think young people were simply voting about tuition fees. But it wasn't just young people that supported Corbyn. I think critically you've got rejuvenated working class Labour voters, and those big rallies that were held, that they mobilised them and gave them a voice and so on after years of being ignored and so forth. But also UKIP voters. You know, Corbyn showed, it's not that long ago, people were talking about the deindustrialised northern working class racists voting for Brexit. You see lots of them going back to vote for Corbyn, to vote against austerity, against cuts, for pay rises and so forth. But also I think in the Corbyn message, all those things, but also a sense that you can actually argue that we want to live in a less mean society. You know, we want to live in a slightly nicer, more caring world, that life isn't just about how you survive, how you get ahead, how you do people over, and so on. And, you know, really putting solidaristic ideas it was important. It is a very, very important question how that mood becomes a force, an organised force that's not simply every 5 years at elections. But it is connected to movements in a different sense, in that a lot of the backbone of momentum and the supporters of Corbyn come from the Stop the War years, which is, that's important. So point taken. The question then is you talked about dismantling neoliberalism and the possibility of a candidate who may or may not dismantle neoliberalism. Some people say that neoliberalism has moved beyond the point of being a policy option, and it's now become the modus operandi of capitalism today. I wonder what you think about that.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else? Thomas, and then Thomas.
Sure. I wanted to ask a question about a comment you made earlier that throughout history, the only real periods in which you've seen fascist crackdowns are where there's significant resistance from below. And it seems like there hasn't been sufficient resistance emanating from below for that to actually become a reality today. That's at least what I got from the general gist of what you said. But if there is a kind of effervescence of left-aligned forces and they rise up, do you foresee that it is possible that there could be a kind of neo-fascist crackdown? And if so, where would that emanate from? What would it look like?
Sorry, one more question.
Yeah, you've spoken about this kind of polarization in the world, but you spoke about the US, okay, because you're talking about Trump, and Western Europe in particular. But, I mean, there are other very important part of the world at the moment. Well, the whole world's important. But the other powerful part is Asia, which has been rising. In India, you have a Hindu nationalist government. Is there too a polarization happening there? Is there also, do you also see an opportunity for the left there?
I'm sorry, your name?
It's John Pampalisa.
John.
Yeah. And in China, I mean, we have the strange phenomenon of a communist party now being almost the world leader of neoliberalism. I mean, Xi Jinping gets up at this conference in Switzerland, whatever it's called. Davos, yeah. And he's arguing for free trade. The US is saying, under Trump, we don't want free trade.
Okay, let me take up these questions. Sam, I very much appreciate what was the point of information that the introduction that you started with. And I think it's really true that while Emmanuel is right that youth overwhelmingly did vote for Corbyn, and indeed also for Trump. For both of them, working class support has played a key role, I think especially for Corbyn, even more so than it did for Sanders. Although we should also be careful to point out one thing. These youth, they're leading pretty precarious lives. Many of the youth, I don't have a number on this, so I'm using vague words like many, and I hate people to do that, and I'm going to have to do it this time. Many of these youth are people who don't ever get permanent jobs anymore. They go from gig to gig, which means that in a country like the United States, they can't get health care because health care is attached to jobs. They can't get any kinds of cohabitation privileges because that requires some kind of, in many cases, it requires some sort of contribution from the employer. So even though they're not industrial workers, they are still what you would call part of the precarious working class or semi-employed professionals. So there's a material reason that they're voting for these people because they do not see any future for them as new entrants into the labor force. So I wouldn't see them as entirely distinct from a working class base. It's just not the blue-collar manufacturing industrial working class base, but Sam's point is very well taken. Now, is neoliberalism sort of so much in our cores that it's become the default option? In political circles, yes. And that's because of the monumental corruption of academics, professors, experts, and the political elites whom they serve. It's been 40 years where if you want to get advance in policy circles, you've got to, every policy initiative you back has to be about competitiveness, productivity, exchange rates, the effect on the currency, et cetera, not about the quality of people's lives, not about job stability, not about security. These words are gone. So there's no doubt that in elite policy circles, this is the de facto. But in my view, policy circles always follow the balance of power. And that's why my talk was about the balance of power. In modern society, the balance of power is between labor and capital. Labor has many colors, it has many genders, it is heterogeneous in many ways. But Emmanuel, this is an abstraction, it's a simplification that is real. It is still labor. And if that labor manages to organize itself, if it manages to overcome its divisions, its traditional pathologies and its mutual hatred, then if it impresses its interests on the political scene, experts will do what they always do. They will simply go to where the power is, and they will try to serve the power the way they've done historically. So it's a qualified no, the answer to your question. It is in our pores insofar as I'm talking about people in rooms like this, because we've been part of the problem for so long. But it need not be, if the balance shifts in the appropriate way. Now, Thomas's question about fascism, you know, when you use words like could it be possible if there was a sufficient threat from below? Yes. Is it at all likely? No, I don't think so. And it's true for, it's this way for a couple of reasons. I think that the conjuncture, now, and it's important that we don't just quibble about words. Let me define what I mean by fascism so we know what we're talking about. What I mean by fascism is not simply an authoritarian form of rule in capitalism. I mean a form of rule in which political rights are extinguished for the vast majority of the population, and which political participation is narrowed to the point of there simply being one or perhaps two parties. That's what I mean by fascism. Therefore, it's possible to have all kinds of authoritarian forms of rule within capitalism that are not fascist, which are still objectionable, which we should be fighting against and worrying about, but they may not be fascist. So the answer to your question is, I don't think fascism the way I have defined it and the way we saw it historically with Hitler and Mussolini is on the cards. Not only because it took a very long period of frustrated attempts at crushing working class power to finally resort to fascism, And I do not see such a long period of a kind of stalemate on the cards. But also the historical experience of fascism has made middle classes and sections of the elite extremely sensitive to it. And they do not see any reason to resort to it when, since the 30s, capitalism has come up in so many other ways of marrying political stability with profit making. And the main lesson they've learned is that a much better weapon than coercion to get workers to show up and offer up their labor, a much better weapon than coercion is resignation. And the best way to get that out of them isn't by repressing them, but by giving them their formal rights, but taking away the means or the wherewithal to exercise those rights. That the US has been the trailblazer in this. Put them in front of their TV, get them to shop every day, show them that there's nothing at stake in the elections, and they'll simply abdicate power to you. That's where they've been. I think even with working class movements, etc., going on, I see little chance of a shift towards anything like fascism. Authoritarianism, yes. That brings me to India and China. For India, John, I don't see much hope right now in the short term for a couple of reasons. One is that in the political scene right now, the BJP is the only national organized party. The Congress has basically collapsed. These third parties that were started out as regional parties or started out as national parties like the Janata Party have effectively become regional parties. Regional parties like the Samajwadi Party in UP or the various offshoots of the Janata Party in Bihar or the BSP in UP have failed to emerge as national parties. So in 2019, sadly, I think the BJP is probably going to win unless something quite dramatic happens. The only other opposition is the left. And as Dilip suggested, it is true that the left has, in many ways, shot itself in the foot over the past 40, 30, 20 years. One of the weaknesses has been a insufficient attention to caste, as Dilip suggests, no doubt about it. But that's not the main reason. And the reason I say that is I do not think in India, I do not think caste is as distinct from class as many people make it out to be. So if you're going to take up the interest of Dalits, of untouchables in India, the vast majority of whom are either landless laborers or unskilled workers, you cannot address their material interests unless you also address their class interests. Which means you're going to have to take up a traditional kind of class. And it's interesting, the last year there are movements emerging now of Dalits in India which see themselves as members of a class-wide mobilization in India, class-wide in which caste questions are nevertheless taken up explicitly. And I think that's the vision, for the future. In India right now, on campuses it's fashionable to use caste as a way of bashing Marxism and all that, but that's because Indian students generally follow whatever American students. So where American students use race to do that, Indian students are using caste. But if the toiling millions of India really take up their interests, sorry Dilip, I know you don't like this, but that's the fact.
America is God's country.
So, why not? The entire vocabulary of the students comes from American post-structuralism. The entire vocabulary of this caste language is coming out of Yale and Princeton. I think they're going to have to take up these class questions. China is a different issue. I think in China is a boiling cauldron of labor activity. Now where it goes, I couldn't predict. So I think the balance right now, the shift towards a kind of more progressive agenda, it's the weight is still in the Atlantic world right now. For the short term. Where it goes in the medium term, I can't say.
Last round, one or two takers. Patrick, Devon. Right, go for it.
Thanks. Really wonderful to hear this. That was Patrick Bond from this School of Governance. In thinking about what that potential uprising could look like if there all these atomistic silo forces are put together. We saw a woman on January 21 with 2 or 3 million solidaristic protesters. we saw some of the economic justice move before, this really important anti-racist, anti-fascist movement. But another one, which we all should be, I think, attuned to, is climate justice. Once Trump exited the Paris Climate Accord, not worth remarking on all of the problems in that document. In the words, one word will do. James Hansen said, the best climate scientist we know, Paris is bullshit. So the departure of Trump is important only, I think, insofar as he said it was because he didn't want the US to have liabilities. In reality, Paris protects the North and BRICS countries, like this one especially, from liabilities for climate debt, or polluter pays. And that's why I want to ask, in the immediate aftermath of Trump's victory, and again with a rising concern around the world after the Paris climate withdrawal, the call was made for sanctions. There are two big companies, Goldman Sachs and ExxonMobil, that are in the fractions of capital connected to Trump. You might agree closest, but they would represent great targets. But with a Naomi Klein or Joe Stiglitz advocating this, and with probably many of us wanting some solidaristic opportunity, and let's be frank, we've done very badly in finding the US consulate in Sandton or the embassy in Pretoria, although our comrades in Durban and in Cape Town have had some good protests. What's your thought about that, about moving, the United States finding a way beyond the fragments of opposition, all of these single issue groups, and finding some popular front? And secondly, international solidarity with those who would like to see not just Trumpism, but US corporate capitalism weakened in this process.
So there's Devin and Joe.
Vivek, I'd like you to say a little bit more about who is the left in the USA. Now, we followed quite closely last year what was happening with Sanders' campaign, and then the critique of people, what's the name, Kashwan Sawan?
Shamasa.
Right.
Shamasa.
Saying why remaining within the Democratic Party. The offer from the Green Party, Jill Stein, saying come and join us. But then she turns out to be a slightly strange character with link to Putin. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
And then Joe, and we're going to wrap up.
So, Vivek, I was really interested that nationalism barely featured in your analysis. You know, you talk about economic nationalism, but I'd just like to ask a question of how you're thinking about nationalism in relation to the Trump era.
Let me start with Patrick's. I guess those are some you just threw at me, Patrick. Because I think the two parts of your question was, how does one feel about moving beyond the fragments and bringing up? My answer is I support that endeavor of moving beyond the fragments. I do think that the way to move, it's unlikely to be climate justice that provides that. Because like every other issue, climate justice has class dimensions to it. And Al Gore right now is the mainstream figure in America when it comes to climate justice. So until it's married to some sort of agenda against capital, I see the chances of that being remote. And that's going to mean that, see, the left, the dying gasp of the mainstream intelligentsia now against a class and a socialist agenda is to pit race and gender and sexuality against it, with the accusation that socialists want to shit all over these things. And of course, the history of the left in the 20th century is that it's always been in the forefront of all these struggles, including in South Africa. Struggle against racism, struggle against gender. What makes the left distinctive, though, is that it doesn't treat it as race and gender per se, but it says the anti-racism with working class blacks as the embodiment of what it means to be anti-racist, and similarly with gender. So I hew to the view, and clearly this is why Sanders resonated with so many people, is that he said all of these issues have to be central to a left agenda, but it's got to be the interests of working people that we put, whether they're black, female, or whatever working people, right? And I think climate change is exactly the same. We have to address climate change with an agenda that shows that you cannot even begin to deal with it seriously except through an anti-corporate agenda. Just think about carbon. how do you plan to move away from coal when it's guaranteed to displace hundreds of thousands of workers? How do you plan to move away from it without a massive jobs program to retrain them, to re-employ them? And how are you going to do that through a Democratic Party-led neoliberal agenda which leaves everything to private corporate managers? How are you going to deal with imploding cities in which black people are now living in Bantustans, essentially in the US, unless you take up an anti-corporate agenda so that you can start up massive programs of urban revitalization, of jobs, etc. To continually look at these things as ends in themselves without locating them in the power balance of capitalism means they will continue to be these fragments. So my view is that I absolutely support the agenda for moving beyond those fragments, and I think that agenda is going to be what the left traditionally offered, but with a more vitalized and educated sensitivity to the interests of the constituent elements of the left, which is the various oppressed groups within the left. And of course the same goes for solidarity. Now, Devin, who is the left? Now, there are two answers to this, Devin. One is, until 3-4 years ago, the left was considered to be, in mainstream discourse, the Democratic Party and some elements within the Democratic Party. Today, I think very few people think of the Democrats, even in the mainstream press, they're not referred to as the left anymore. Now, maybe it's the Greens. Okay, the Greens have a lot of good people in them, and lots of good programs. The difficulty with the Greens is they cannot, unless there's a cataclysmic collapse of the Democratic Party, the Greens will always remain a marginal figure in the American scene because of the vagaries of a winner-take-all electoral system. Unless the Greens find some way of entering the electoral system with a huge splash, people will see it as a wasted vote. And that has two consequences. Most people don't vote for them, and the people who do come to them are people who are, let's just say, kind of quirky, who fail to attract other members. The ideological left in the United States used to be in the trade union movement, in the Communist Party, the Socialist parties, all of whom had some kind of working class base. And that was where, at the time of the New Deal, or even in the 60s, when there was a revitalization of the left, that's where you saw it. And in the black communities, there's this myth that in the black community it was the church. Not true. The church played an important role. But the untold history of the civil rights movement is the crucial place that organized labor, organized black labor played in ensuring the success of the civil rights movement. What's happened in the past 30 years is that all of those elements of the left have been destroyed. And where the left now basically is on campuses, which is basically a death warrant. It essentially means the left spends all its time talking about nothing, pointing fingers at each other. Kind of the stuff that you see in places like this. You haven't talked about this, why didn't you mention that? That kind of stuff. That's what the left does. You hate this, you support, So, and you saw this in the Sanders campaign. And Hillary, she's a genius. The second she was outmaneuvered by Sanders, she brought in intersectionality as a way of saying, class, Bernie is white, class means white, Hillary, will bring complexity into it, which means, blah, blah, blah. That came off of campuses. That didn't come out of from the shop floor. It didn't come out of communities. Intersectionality is something that academics invented. And that's where we are now. If the future of the left in the United States depends on one and only one thing. The working class movement, by which I mean black people, women, let's be clear about us. Let me assure all of you, not just white people. That movement gets going again. Historically, that movement has gotten going again when there's also been an articulate, militant group of intellectuals, some produced by the workers, some coming from the outside, that's working in it. Yeah? That is going to require the left moving off the campus. Right now, that's not happening. Perhaps it will. Until that time, the moniker, the label is going to remain confined to either marginal groupings like the Green Party or these under-socialized, over-intellectualized things on campuses called the left. Now comes Jill's question about nationalism. It's a great question, really. Jill, I feel inadequate to be able to answer it because I think that is one of the kind of the wild cards in all this. Nationalism takes many forms, of course. So historically, of course, one form it took was a kind of progressive nationalism that came out of national liberation movements which sought to clear out a space for national development in the global system against the power of core countries, transnational. Okay, let's just call that progressive nationalism. What we're seeing these days, of course, mostly is a very different kind of nationalism, which is coming from two sources. One is the very clear machinations of political parties that are seeking to capitalize on the anxiety of working people. The other source, of course, is those anxieties of working people. I don't see that dying away anytime soon, and here's why. The EU is just tottering. The European Union is barely surviving politically. And the attacks on it are going to continue because it is such a unilaterally neoliberal institution. But those attacks are easily going to, and most likely going to take the form of some kind of nationalism. Some kind of call for national control over economic management. Now, and you can see that as a plus in that, just like there's nothing sacred about the nation state, in the short run, it might be the only tool we have for some kind of democratic management of the economy. So we might have to settle for that. On the other hand, it is something that easily veers into ugliness. And we've seen that ugliness in the Brexit vote. We've seen the ugliness in France. It becomes a terrain of struggle. The reason I'm unconfident about answering your question is that I think right now all we can say is that it's going to be an object of struggle, in which historically the left has always been outnumbered. So it's a worrisome phenomenon.
Things to underline before we leave. I think this was a very rich and engaged conversation. I mean, the idea of non-hegemonic neoliberalism clearly featured in this conversation. And you know, it's reflected in the shifts in electorates, the search for ways out, potential openings for the left. But it's also about a neoliberalism articulating with particular kinds of nationalism, particular kinds of racism, fundamentalism, and so on. So there's something else happening to neoliberalism which I think we still need to talk about. I think we placed fascism in the conversation, but I think in the debates, in the discussions, I mean, it can go in any direction. It can go towards right-wing nationalism. It can go towards authoritarianism. But there are also very deep crises. I mean, capital doesn't have answers to the climate crisis. And I think as it gets worse, it's going to get militarized. And is that going to be the new fascism? I don't know, but I think these are issues we've got to think about. I also think that, yes, Trumpism, Trump, etc., very much rooted in deep historical processes. And I think Vivek really spotlighted that for us. It is an object of analysis, but also an object of struggle going forward. I want to thank the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences for funding this Democratic Marxism Theory and Public Lecture Series, the International Relations Department, the Sociology Department, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for funding the book series associated with this. And just to inform all of you, on September 18th, we'll be having a theory seminar on Brazil, BRICS, and sub-imperialism. Ana Garcia, a Marxist theorist from Brazil, will be here with us running the seminar for about 3 hours, from about 10 to 1. We're then going to have a public panel on the 19th of September on feminism and Marxism. Everybody's invited to that. And finally, a big thanks to all of you and to Vivek for pulling it.